Good morning.
Good morning.
I'll be reading from the book of Esther, 6, 1 through 9. That night the king could not sleep, so he ordered the book of the Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. It was found recorded there that Mordecai had exposed Bethana and Teresh, two of the king's officers, who guarded the doorway, who conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. What honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this? The king asked. Nothing has been done for him, his attendants answered. The king said, Who is in the court? Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the palace to speak to the king about impaling Mordecai on the pole he had set up for him. His attendants answered, Haman is standing in the court. Bring him in, the king ordered. When Haman entered, the king asked him what should be done for the man the king delights to honor. Now Haman thought to himself, Who is there that the king would rather honor than me? So he answered the king, For the man the king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe the king has worn and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest on his head. This is the word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
Last week I left you, just a second, he's a little bit taller than me. Last week I left you with a huge cliffhanger in the middle of Esther. So I'm going to give you a fast recap for those of y'all that weren't here, or those of y'all who, I did see a few falling asleep last night. So here's your recap. God isn't mentioned by name in all of the book of Esther, but as you read it, you see that his hand of providence is all over it. So King Xerxes was the king, and he was king over 127 provinces from India to Kush, and he's just banished his queen for not doing what he told her to do. And so once he finally sobers up from all of the banquets, the partying that he's had, he realizes he's sad that he banished the queen, and his council comes together and says, well, let's go find you another queen. And so this is how Esther ends up being the next queen. And Mordecai is Esther's older family member that raised her after her own parents died. And so Mordecai has also been put in a leadership position as well. So Esther and Mordecai are Jews, and the king has no idea. And so you heard what Tim had read, that, Mordecai had overheard an assassination attempt on the king, and he reports it, and the king's life is spared. But then we have the villain of this book, which is Haman. And the king had given Haman a seat of honor that was higher than that of all the other nobles. And Haman is classically and historically known as the enemy of the Jews. And so Haman's first issue with Mordecai is because Mordecai won't bow down to him. So Haman cons the king into creating this irrevocable edict, an official order to destroy, kill, and annihilate every single Jewish person in all 127 provinces on one specific day. And so Mordecai tells Esther that it's time for her to speak up. And so I'm just going to read this for you really quick from chapter 4. Well, I guess we don't have to be in a hurry. This is in chapter 4, beginning in verse 13. This is Mordecai talking to Esther. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it's against the law. And if I perish, I perish." So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions. And so I ended last week with Esther about to go before the king. And so this is where we pick up today in the story, and this begins in chapter 5. And I just have to read this because I can't tell it any better than it's written. So you can follow along with me in your Bibles or on the screens. But this is beginning in chapter 5. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall, facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her and held out to her the gold scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. Then the king asked, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half of the kingdom, it will be given you." "If it pleases the king," replied Esther, "let the king, together with Haman, come today to a banquet I have prepared for him." "Bring Haman at once," the king said, "so that we may do what Esther asked." So the king and Haman went to the banquet Esther had prepared. As they were drinking wine, the king asked Esther, "Now, what is your petition? It will be given to you. And what is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted." Esther replied, "My position and request is this. If the king regards me with favor, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for them. Then I will answer the king's question." Haman went out that day, happy and in high spirits. But when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor showed fear in his presence, he was filled with rage against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. Calling together his friends and Zeresh his wife, Haman boasted to them about his vast wealth, his many sons, and all the ways the king had honored him, and how he had elevated him above the other nobles and officials. "And that's not all," Haman added. "I'm the only person Queen Esther invited to accompany the king to the banquet she gave, and she's invited me along with the king tomorrow. But all this gives me no satisfaction, as I long to see that Jew, Mordecai, sitting at the king's gate." His wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, "Have a pole set up, reaching to the height of 15 cubits, and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai impaled on it. Then go with the king to the banquet and enjoy yourself." This suggestion delighted Haman, and he had the pole set up. You know, it's so interesting to me that King Xerxes, he says, "So what do you want, Queen Esther? You can have up to half of my kingdom." And she says, "I want to have a banquet." I mean, it's like she said, "I want to go to dinner with you." And then at the banquet, she says it again. And if you're like me, as you're reading this, you're screaming in your head, "Let's go, woman, stop stalling. All of the Jews are fixing to be killed. Let's bring this to a close. The Jewish population is counting on you." You know, we're not told why she kind of drags this out. But I just want to take a random shot here. Maybe there's some womanly intuition going on. Maybe she's reading the room. Now, when I've done something and I'm not quite sure how Brian is going to react, I read the room. "So how was your day?" And then it's become routine, you know, when one of us has something to tell the other, to say, "I have a confession to make." And we've developed these code words, "I have a confession to make," because usually the one hearing it goes to worst case scenario, you know? And so it makes it so much easier for me to tell him that I just spent $50 on a pair of boots. Especially when I tell him, you know, they were on sale. Like I've done a great job of not paying full price. So I wonder if Esther is reading the room. She has to tell him the fact that she's Jewish, that this has just never come up in conversation. And that the edict that he signed is about to have her family, her heritage, herself destroyed, killed, annihilated. She's reading the room. If she just blurts out that she's a Jew, he might just react. Not only the shock, but perhaps the humiliation that he didn't know this about his queen, and he might turn things against her. And I wonder if she's reading the room. Knowing who Haman is, Haman is classically, like I said, and historically known as the enemy of the Jews. She's wanting to set Haman up as well. And I think she's subtly and surely moving things around for the good of a lot of people. She didn't just rush in like a bulldozer. This dinner that she wants to have with the king and Haman would have been a more private banquet than the huge banquets that we saw at the beginning of this book. And remember, there are people fasting and very likely praying. And this gives them this time that she's pulling out or waiting longer, time to play out as well. The point of fasting, to humbly seek the help of the Lord. We talked last week about the book of Esther would make a fantastic play. There's tragedy and triumph and even comedy. And chapter 6 is the best kind of comedy unless you're Haman. And this is what Tim read for us earlier. The king had insomnia. God is working through this ordinary challenge that many of us have from time to time. The king can't sleep. So he does what many of us do. He reads. Well, actually, he had someone read to him. So he has the books brought into him, and he starts thinking, Mordecai helped me out before. He saved my life. Was he ever thanked? Was he ever honored? So what can we do now? What can we be done? And then Haman is the next on the scene. And Haman is so full of himself thinking, it's got to be me. It's got to be me that the king is wanting to honor. Yes, king, this should happen. And just here again, what he's asking. This is in chapter 6, verse 7. So he answered the king, for the man the king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe that the king has worn, and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on his head. Then let the robe and the horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. And the king says, great, don't leave anything out that you suggested. Go and do this. Can you imagine the bitter gall that Haman is having to swallow? Haman has to announce it to the entire city and lead Mordecai around on this royal horse. And it says that Haman goes home with his head covered in grief. The action is being taken out of Haman's control. God uses everything to further his purposes. God is using the king's insomnia. The one book in the Bible where God isn't mentioned by name, but he is all over the details. God is the star of this book, even if his name isn't mentioned. He's advancing his purposes for the salvation of his people for all time. It's redemptive history. He does this on a micro level every day in our lives as well. It's endlessly fascinating to me that God is both obvious and also very detailed behind the scenes. God works on all the levels, all of the time. And it's so hard for our brains to make this compute, right? It's comforting to know that we don't have to latch onto God and grasp at Him just to guarantee that we'll be okay. I mean, what is faith? Remember from your youth days, the trust fall? You know, one person would stand in front of another person. And the front person would have to blindly fall back, trusting that the person behind them was going to catch them. I mean, that's real trust. There's nothing that front person can do, and they're completely out of control and dependent on the person behind them to catch them. I think our faith in the Lord is so much more that instead of just latching on when things get hard, it's like we've made latching on our backup plan. But it's about the relationship with the Lord, and that relationship requires trust. And how many times do we think that it's up to us? You know, you've heard God helps those who help themselves, which isn't biblical, by the way. God is always helping His people, whether they're looking for it or not. And that's the comfort that we are held by Christ as believers. In Isaiah 52, verses 9 and 10, it says, "Burst into songs of joy together, you ruins of Jerusalem, for the Lord has comforted His people. He has redeemed Jerusalem. The Lord will lay bare His holy arm in the sight of all the nations, and all the ends of the earth will see the salvation of our God." Sorry, it was just a little bit of a rabbit trail there, but there's just so much good stuff in this book. So then we get back to Esther, okay? So remember, we're now in chapter 7, and the title of this chapter is Haman is Impaled. And this is the moment where the king says, "What is it that you want?" And she replies, this is the second one. This is when she goes before him after the second banquet. And she says, "I ask that you spare my life and the life of my people. We've been sold to destruction, death, and annihilation." And the king is so confused. And he's like, who would devise such a scheme? And Esther said, "An adversary and enemy, this vile Haman." So guess how Haman dies? On his own gallows, the own pole that he had built for Mordecai. And then I find it interesting that it says after he had been impaled, that the king's anger subsided. You know, the second half of the book of Esther is pretty rough. I mean, your Lifetime movie qualities have really gone away. And this is where the drama has been leading us right here. You know, that first edict still exists for the Jews to be wiped out. And it says that the edict of the evil Haman cannot be revoked. I mean, but couldn't it? He is the king, right? But his pride is too grand to even go back on that. And so the gold scepter is extended to Esther once again. And she asks him if he would please write another irrevocable edict. Basically, he gives her a blank check. And he says to Esther and Mordecai, write in the king's name whatever you want it to be. So the first edict is still in play, but the second edict now says that the Jews can defend themselves. So what was supposed to happen to the Jews, just the opposite happened. So hear this in chapter 9, verse 1. On the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, the edict commanded by the king was to be carried out. On this day, the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them. But now the tables were turned, and the Jews got the upper hand over those who hated them. And then it goes on to say such a great celebration was established, and it is one that the Jews still celebrate today. And then the book of Esther ends with this verse, chapter 10 of verse 3. Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Xerxes, preeminent among the Jews, and held in high esteem by his many fellow Jews because he worked for the good of his people and spoke up for the welfare of all of the Jews. You know, one of the repetitions throughout the book of Esther is the use of the word favor. Esther asked the king, if I have found favor. And it says that the king had found favor in Esther. In Hebrew, the word there is hesed. There isn't a one-to-one true English definition of hesed. I mean, favor doesn't completely define it. It's the steadfast love of God. The definition of one looking kindly upon you, of someone giving you the best that they have to give just because they want to. Hesed. And it's beautiful. There's a beautiful direct correlation of Esther trying to get the hesed, the favor of the king. And here we sit today as believers in the place of already having the hesed of the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And it doesn't have anything to do with what we look like or what we can accomplish in our own strength or even how good we are. We have God's hesed, his favor, and we are called to reflect that to others. There are 5 spiritual rhythms in the book of Esther. There's lament and fasting, lament, fasting, rest, celebration, and remembrance. And this book ends with celebration and remembrance. And so I believe that today is a day that we too can remember and celebrate how God's provision and presence has brought us this far. And I'm not just talking about the church stuff. I mean, we can certainly see God's hand of provision and presence. But I'm talking about in your own life. What all has God brought you through? What all has God, where have you seen his mercy and his grace? His hand is on our story, whether we say his name or not. Esther isn't the hero of this story, and Mordecai isn't the hero of this story. God is the hero of this story, and he's the hero of our story too. If you haven't read the book of Esther, I beg you to read it this week. In our time of reflection and response today, I want to give us time to do that, to reflect on how far God has brought you, and then choose to respond in thanksgiving and gratitude. We have the favor, the hesed of the Lord, the steadfast love of God. Let's spend some silent time in prayer as we reflect and as we respond. And you are welcome to come and kneel before the Lord if you'd like. And after a little bit of silent time, I will close us in prayer. Won't you respond?